Our last session, we always save the best for last, is a panel on resourcing for digitization impact. And I'm going to allow the moderator, Al Horvath, to come up and proceed with that panel. Thank you.
Okay, so it is the best for last, and thank you for hanging with us this afternoon for the final discussion session of the 2017 Smithsonian Digitization Fair. For those of you who weren't at the reception last night, I'm Al Horvath, Undersecretary for Problems and Complaints at the Smithsonian, Finance and Administration. And what I'm going to do today is actually fairly easy. I'm going to moderate a discussion on resourcing our digital ambitions. So this talented and experienced panel will put together a very practical punctuation mark to the aspirational discussions that you've all been engaged in over the last few days. And they will highlight some tremendous progress that's been made around the whole challenge of how we provide resources to make all of these things happen. So your reward for staying with us is that you will get all of these great ideas that will help you go back and make your dreams a reality. So let me just quickly tell you who is going to speak, and then I'll turn it over to our first speaker. We'll go in order. Each speaker will give about a 10-minute overview of their particular topic, and then we'll have discussion following. So our panelists are Meghan Ferriter, Senior Innovation Specialist, National Digital Initiatives at the Library of Congress; Bob Horton, Assistant Director, Collections and Archives, the National Museum of American History here at the Smithsonian; Jaap Otte, Senior Development Officer, Corporate Initiatives, and a big part of our fundraising initiatives around digitization. And then finally, Bill Tompkins, Director of the National Collections Program at the Smithsonian. And Jaap will kick us off.
Thank you, Al. So I wanted to talk about resourcing through collaborating with technology companies and using the Autodesk example as a case study to highlight some of those points. And unfortunately, Brian Matthews stole my thunder yesterday during his keynote. Thank you, Brian. But it's a nice way because this way you're already somewhat familiar with it. I'm just going to pick a couple of things and hopefully that will be helpful for anyone who is thinking about resourcing with outside parties. So just a kind of a very quick summary of the collaboration that the Smithsonian with its Digitization Program Office has had over the last few years with Autodesk. Autodesk did two large transformative projects at the Smithsonian with us. One of them is the 3D viewer that we have, which is really the vehicle through which we have are making our 3D models available to the public. That was specifically developed for the Smithsonian with our input. And then the second one is the 3D scanning of the Apollo command module Columbia, which we did last year, which was another important project for the Smithsonian and was done again in a very collaborative fashion. Besides that, Autodesk has also done many other smaller things, including, for example, cash donations to the program, something that Brian alluded to yesterday as well. I just want to start with when you're thinking about collaborations, it's really about matching offers and needs, of course, from both sides. So what's basically what we have discovered at the Smithsonian doing digitization when we speak with companies, that we have a couple of things to offer here that might not be always on everybody's mind, and things that are really attractive for our partners. The biggest one is actually probably from companies like Autodesk perspective is that we have very challenging problems, really interesting problems to work on, things that haven't been figured out yet, and that you can work with us on solving those problems in a way that you wouldn't be able to do for example, a paying customer. So that's a really great way. The other thing is that when you do those projects with us, you can speak about them in great detail, which again is rarely possible for a customer that's basically a paying customer, especially not if it's the federal government, as I've heard. Another important thing is that for some of our partners is that the Smithsonian is a huge content repository. We have an enormous amount of content. Our collections, 150 million objects. It's incredible what's in there. So that's another very attractive asset. And then of course, from the digitization program office specifically, we're looking for digitization technologies. That's kind of what we're getting out of that, and in addition to a potential platform for content that we would like to put out to the public. So if you look at that, I should have gone to this slide earlier. So if you look at that, I would call that think out of the box. So we started with asking ourselves, who do we want to work with in the industry, academic institutions, etc. And basically, instead of looking at, so we have a price tag on something, let's go and find a bunch of money. We actually said, who can help us with resolving this problem? So it's really focused on collaborating on solving the challenges. And if you, for example, listen to Brian yesterday during the keynote, he said specifically, Autodesk had to write new code basically to help resolve the problem of how to scan the command module. So that then in turn they were able to use in new product that they're developing for other customers. So that was hugely valuable in their case. They also, it's also a solution that they developed for us that even if we had the money, we wouldn't have been able to buy in the market. So that's another important driver for us to actually seek out the collaborations with technology companies. Another thing to realize is that the Smithsonian is a huge repository of content. So when most people think of the Smithsonian as 19 museums, 9 research centers on the National Mall. I mean, it's obviously changing because we are doing a lot online right now, but that's still kind of the overall perspective on us. If you look at it from some of the largest technology companies who are really trying to develop or have platforms for digital content, they look at us as someone from HTC said, the biggest authentic content repository in the world, basically. I mean, that's obviously very promising for us if we would be able to kind of use that position. And so basically, I mean, that comes from I think, what probably several of you have realized, the really several of the largest technology companies, we're calling it tech, but it's really, they're media companies that are basically, looking for content that they can, authentic content that they can present to the world, and the Smithsonian has a lot of authentic content. But of course, a lot of that content is currently inaccessible. I mean, that's why we're working on digitization. So one of my advices is to be flexible when you are working with technology companies, if you're seeking to work with them. Traditionally, the Smithsonian comes from approaches these kind of partnerships from a donation perspective, and we have said actually that doesn't always work. In the case of Autodesk, that is still working, but there are other partnerships and collaborations that we have where we had to basically go to other types of tools to make it work. So sometimes we have a no-cost contract. It could be a business venture. We have started to explore that. The Smithsonian has an enterprise arm that can be used for that. But it could also be a vendor relationship that's really very deep, and sometimes it's a hybrid or a collaborator that we work with. Is sometimes it's a vendor, sometimes it's a donor, depending on the circumstance. But what I'm saying is that you need to basically be flexible in how you approach this and not say, okay, it's not a donation, so I throw it over the wall, or I say no. Basically, that's because the companies that look at us to want to work with us, they basically don't care in most cases what structure it is exactly. They just want to get something to work, and so do we. Another important thing, at least with several of the technology companies, is that they are looking. They're not looking for traditional sponsorship benefits like the Smithsonian and others are still offering. Your name on the wall, logos. They're looking for authentic storytelling opportunities, and that's something that you can really only accomplish with a partnership where the partner is truly involved in what you're doing with the Smithsonian. In general, the press tends to ignore any news about companies writing big checks or anything that doesn't make it in the news normally. But collaborations like the one we had with Autodesk, where we scanned the Apollo 11, was mentioned in the Washington Post. Brian was actually extensively interviewed for FT television, so that's being picked up on. So what you see then with companies like theirs, that they will come specifically with a communications plan, and that's something that was new for us as well at the Smithsonian, but I think we have gotten comfortable with that, and actually that also works to our advantage if there's a good communications plan, because we can only do so much to bring our stories out. My last point that I want to make is that there are also some challenges. It's not always, we had to invent a lot of things, and some things don't always work. So one of the challenges is that although the Smithsonian outside parties look at us as a huge content repository, it's not always that easy to then share that content or give it to any commercial party. I mean, I don't know whether if you all saw the previous panel with Lauren Gutenplan, for example. We have our terms of use. They restrict commercial use, all of that. So basically, that's not an easy discussion, but theoretically, it can be done through our, for example, our enterprise arm. So those are just things that kind of fall outside of the standard ways that we work with partners, but we're trying to do that. So, but it's not that easy. Another thing is that, just like with any other traditional sponsorships, a lot of companies are obviously looking for return on investment. So how are you going to put a price tag on some of these things that a partner puts really a lot of resources in, like the command module or other projects that they're doing with the Smithsonian? So how, when someone says, why are we doing this with the Smithsonian, spending so many resources on this? So that's something to you might have to basically make a case for why they're doing it without being able to put a dollar value on it. Another thing that we have noticed in our collaborations with technology companies is the difference in time horizon. While the Smithsonian, a 170-year-old institution, often thinks in years, and we might say, in 5 years' time, we're okay with having a solution for this problem. A lot of our partners might say, actually, I need something in 1 year that I can demonstrate basically that it works. And, so those are things that you have to reconcile them. And I already mentioned that, we you have to kind of pick the tool that fits best, sometimes multiple tools to kind of structure a partnership. So that kind of goes to the point of no size fits all, basically. There is no standard approach, and each of these partnerships has their own characteristics and challenges. And then my last is really a disclaimer. These technical collaborations are great for technical problems that you have, but not everything that we do or the Smithsonian does has this really high demand for innovation and research. Sometimes you just need someone to help fund what's staff costs or things that products that are great but that are completely off the shelf, basically. So that's you have to also work with more traditional ways to get resources, basically, including possibly private donors, foundations, more traditional sponsorships, where it's more about recognition and all of that. So that's what I wanted to conclude with. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I really want to thank Diane Zorich and all the staff of the DPO's office for all the work they put into organizing this conference. It's been a fabulous 2 days. I think I also want to acknowledge all of the keynote speakers as well as the panelists that have contributed, as well as all of our sponsors. I think the conversations that happen in this room, and especially out in the exhibition concourse, is really important to this topic. So can we have a round of applause for that group? As Al said, I'm Bill Tompkins, Director of the Smithsonian's National Collections Program. In case you don't know my office, the mission of my office is really we're dedicated to the improvement of the overall stewardship of Smithsonian collections. And we do that by providing central leadership as well as policy oversight and strategic planning, as well as program support for not just unit-based, but pan-institutional collections management initiatives. And one of those initiatives includes the administration and management of an institution-wide program, which has been in existence since fiscal year 2006, and that being the Collections Care and Preservation Fund. With the establishment of that funding source, we have really made significant progress in strengthening collections preservation, and more important, especially for our discussions today in the last 2 days, is the accessibility. And that's been of millions and millions of specimens and objects here at the Smithsonian, ranging from national icons to frozen biomaterials, through the allocation of funds to support unit-based and pan-institutional projects across the institution. My piece of the discussion today, I'd really like to briefly outline our strategy for addressing our critical needs in collection stewardship, what was our approach over the last 15 years or so, and then wearing my hat regarding being a funding source for at least internal Smithsonian collection stewardship activities, is to talk about and provide advice for you for maximizing your resources for greater impact. We've already heard the size of the collections here at the Smithsonian, so I'm not going to speak much about that, but as you all know, assembled over more than 170 years, these collections really contribute to and are central to our mission, to our programmatic activities, as well as the core activities of the institution at large. They serve as the intellectual base for scholarship, for discovery, for exhibition, and education. We talked yesterday during the keynote of the impact of collections, and we're all aware that some of the collections that were acquired more than a century or more ago is now playing an important role today as we face various societal as well as scientific issues that are facing the world in the 21st century. As you've witnessed over the last 2 years, or the last 2 days, we've talked about new technologies, new digital technologies, including machine learning, which really provides us new insights, new ways to learn from the collections, which to me is just astounding and is really thrilling and exciting. At the same time, just trying to manage these collections, it's really a challenge. The sheer size, the complexity, the diversity of the collections make their management as unprecedented and complex as the collections themselves. So I'd like to talk a little about, so what was our approach over the last few years to address those critical needs? Oops, sorry. There we go. First of all, I'd like to start with something that an old colleague of mine, luckily they've left the institution, I don't think they really mind, and I'm not going to do justice to the accent, but they used to always tell me, Bill, you need to have a plan, you need to have a strategy. And so I've always kept that in mind. Following the completion of an institution-wide collections management study and the nationwide Heritage Health Index survey in 2004, the Smithsonian senior management really came together and said we need to start coming up with new strategies of how to approach the challenges we were facing in collection stewardship. This included the creation of the first ever Smithsonian Collections Advisory Committee, which still exists to today. And really we were charged to help establish what were our collections management priorities at that time and how should we proceed together to address those. It also worked on basically taking the concept of the Collections Care and Preservation Fund and making it into a true reality. I think at this point, it's also important that we understand that collections management is not a single process or procedure, that it's made up of a series of component parts that are interwoven, interdependent, and ongoing. And I think whenever we talk to our funding sources, especially congressional members and their staff, as well as the Office of Management and Budget, we have to emphasize the last point. It's ongoing. Even though we may fund a project for inventory or digitization, we're going to come back. We're going to have to continue to increase our investment in those activities. And so I think that's something that's really important to tell or articulate to any funding source. With that said, the conditions of our collection storage facilities, the quality of storage equipment and preservation, as well as the ability to document collections in manual and digital formats, really directly affects the Smithsonian's as well as any museum's ability to make collections available to scholars and to the general public worldwide. Collections planning, therefore, collections care, collections storage, collections digitization, represent a continuum of activities which support the Smithsonian's mission and especially our new strategic plan. So let's see how we approached our challenges over the last 15 years. We have come to acknowledge that an effective strategy for addressing our shared challenges really depends on a collaborative, pan-institutional, interdisciplinary approach, reflected in a number of our recent pan-institutional initiatives, including collection space, mass digitization, cryo and time-based media collections management, collections emergency management, and the collections preservation environment. We have strategically directed some central collections care resources, that especially being the Collections Care and Preservation Fund, to make targeted improvements in the documentation, preservation, storage, and accessibility of our collections. With this funding, we have raised the level of collection stewardship in a pragmatic, strategic, and integrated manner by prioritizing and systematically addressing our collections care needs. We have been very successful with this approach, especially because it's based on sound collections assessment data, innovative collections care methodologies, economies of scale, as well as project-driven activities, including collection moves and collections digitization. We didn't do it in silos, we did it together. Our goal is to maximize the collections management activities that can occur in any given project while limiting the risk of handling the collections too often and too frequently. Holistic collections level management has enabled comprehensive improvements which benefit the greatest number of collection items, the greatest number of collecting units and stakeholders in an efficient, practical, and cost-effective manner. So let's look at prioritization. For the first time, the Smithsonian has robust institution-wide data on the national collections, their physical condition, the state of their digitization, and the current conditions of our collection space or collection storage as a result of three important pan-institutional initiatives. When combined, the information provides us with really important information, data that informs decision-making, allows us to set priorities, as well as it allows us to guide the allocation of resources. As you heard from Diane yesterday, for example, she talked about some of the data on collections digitization, the status of that. Our office and the Digitization Program Office co-manages the Collections and Digitization Reporting System, better known as CEDARS, which currently captures assessment data to document and measure unit progress in preservation as well as digitization. This allows us, again, to set priorities and to determine, the appropriate resources to make improvements. Similarly, our office has partnered with Smithsonian facilities over the last few years. We are co-managing a collection space system that basically documents and monitors the current and conditions of and quality of conditions of collection storage of collection space across the institution. This guides our collection space planning as well as many facility capital projects. Please excuse this graphic if you see yourself in this and you're sort of offended by the component part that I've attached your discipline to. But I think this graphic is very useful. Although the management of collections at the institution is very decentralized, the authority to manage them is delegated to individual collecting units who assign that responsibility to respective staff. So it's not really managed centrally. So myself and Al Horvath and other senior managers really have no control over collections management, but we do have influence. But even though it is decentralized, recent initiatives have resulted in a multiple unit or pan-institutional cross-disciplinary approach to collections-related challenges. But really, it's provided opportunities to work together for the greater good in improving collection stewardship. We have forged new collaborative relationships between various disciplines at the institution with the understanding that we are all stewards, not just those that work in collections management as conservators, curators, collections managers, registrars, archivists, librarians. It does include the facility managers, architects, engineers, so that really it doesn't depend on whether you have direct or indirect responsibilities. You are a steward of the collections because you work at the Smithsonian. Together, we support holistic strategies that enable comprehensive improvements to collections care. And this has been our approach, especially with respect to current and planned mass digitization, preservation, and collection space efforts. So let me put my hat on from a funding source standpoint, being that we manage the Collections Care and Preservation Fund. In applying for whether it's internal or external grants, as well as planning any digitization projects or collections-related projects, I would strongly encourage you to align your activities, your project activities, with your unit's strategic plan, goals, and priorities. I know that seems obvious, but looking at internal as well as external applications for grant funding, very often it's very much missing. Also demonstrate the level of impact the project will have on your research, exhibition, and public programming. Articulate the significance of the collections in relationship to the entire holdings of your museum or collecting unit that will be involved in the project and the impact on improving preservation as well as access through digitization. Leverage and demonstrate efficient, effective use of your resources as well as those you're applying for. I think this is truly critical. Think outside of the box. Think globally and implement innovative technology, methods, and sort of workflows which increases efficiencies. I think this is something that you've heard over the last 2 days of the efficiencies in the workflow for digitization, which can make it much more cheaper, much more effective in moving forward. And finally, I think really I encourage you to foster interdisciplinary collaborations with internal and external partners. And as a result of these, you will deepen as well as broaden your impact. Thank you.
So let me start off by saying I'm not Meghan Ferriter. This is an experiment for me. I'm going to talk without slides, so you ought to pretend I'm on the radio. And I'll start with the obvious point. Resources and impact are closely linked, each supporting the other. You need resources to have an impact, but as well, if you can demonstrate impact, you're better placed to attract additional support and funding, because if you can show the differences your work and your projects make. This is especially critical where I work at the Museum of American History, as we have very little funding dedicated to digitization. We need to attract project and grant support. But that's not unusual. I think in general, the nature of cultural heritage funding is rapidly changing from program to project-based budgets, with all that implies. Time-limited 1, 2, and 3-year efforts framed around defined work plans and products. That means there's a need for attracting ongoing support, and use impact will lead to sustainable efforts. But with our focus areas, digitization and the web, impact can be very hard to evaluate. Web tools make it easy to count how many visits, how many unique visitors, how long they spend on the site, but those stats don't indicate what those people did with what they found, if they learned anything, if anything changed. All that's critically important, but terribly difficult to capture. We can complement our count of outputs or throughputs with qualitative information. Increasingly, we're refining that with the use of social media, with examples from my own life being my kids love the Spark Lab. Why aren't the ruby slippers on display? The guy at the archives couldn't help me. So even supplemented with those kinds of things, with surveys like that, evidence is often anecdotal, and besides, prey to what's been defined as the empathy trap. That is, we're attracted to a good story, much the same way we ooh and ah over a picture of a kitten. Those appeal to and reinforce existing assumptions. They may not teach us anything new and may well help to obscure some more important issues that aren't so easy to articulate. So how do we address this? Obviously, one way, and this has been discussed over the course of the conference, is a more rigorous approach to the analysis of both quantitative and qualitative evidence. And I think the your Piana example yesterday is quite impressive. So we can do better. But there's also an alternative, which I'll now discuss, which is more closely planned engagement with a defined group. To borrow a definition used in the library profession, programming is effective to the degree it meets the needs and interests of its target participants. Diane mentioned something similar yesterday when she said delivery with intent. All that has to be defined, though, I think, with the active engagement and participation of our audience, of our participants. So the project I want to talk about, in collaboration with some excellent partners, we are in the first part of a 3-phase process to develop a digital hub for LGBTQ collections. Now, currently, the history of LGBTQ communities is fragmented in collections across the country. It's in different repositories and individual hands, described differently, stored differently, with different levels of accessibility, discoverability, and usability. Our idea is to build a collaborative framework, engaging with an audience at every phase and involving them in the development process. The overall goal is not just to make more content available, but to enhance its value for the primary user base. Others will benefit, but having a defined target allows us to measure success in explicit ways. We think this will support some basic functions such as metadata aggregation, digitization, and access to digital content, what we might call sharing information. But we want to go further towards sharing authority, engaging more active participation of repositories, community members, and researchers in this effort. There are some good examples and models. Umbra, out of the University of Minnesota, is an aggregation of metadata on African American collections. And Mukatu, an online collections management system for indigenous peoples, allows for a variety of engagements, particularly, though, multiple levels of description and interpretation of content generated by the communities themselves. And along with something that's been developed simultaneously called the traditional knowledge labels, that project also allows for different intellectual control regardless of who has physical control of an object. So our project plan is built around a set of milestones with tangible results at each stage, products that demonstrate value, justify costs, and support further investment. That allows for measuring impact in distinct ways. At first, that will be on the level of establishing those partnerships and adopting standards, starting to work together. Later, it will be in the development of the technology and tools that deliver specific benefits. Again, the impact we want to document is in terms of effect, what changed as a result of our work. And that impact is only measurable if there's a target audience and a baseline. So phase one is underway. We've had some initial meetings, and our principal goals are identifying the needs and interests of the audience. Through meetings and the research, we've learned a lot about the LGBT community. First and foremost, that it's not singular. There are communities, which made us realize just how much outreach we needed to do. There had to be active, a much more active plan for outreach in order to achieve our goals. Now, so then we can start to define impact in terms of raising our awareness, what we need to know, inclusion, bringing more people involved into the process, and developing the partnerships and a framework for collaboration, especially to evaluate our technology options. Phase two is planned, and the grant writing is underway. Wish us luck. And the goals are explicitly more outreach, more community development, and a technology prototype, because in our initial meetings, we were told over and over again that it was going to be critical to have a straw man that our communities can analyze and explore in order to attract their attention and support. So the impact is going to be partnerships with a deeper commitment, especially in terms of funding and technology, and some implementation in place, some standards identified, articulated, and vetted. So phase three, which is completely aspirational at this point, is we're up and running a sustainable application. And with that, we really want to achieve the inclusion of a variety of independent individual archives in this. As one of our participants has written about LGBTQ archives, there are lots of them, started by people and they're kept in their garage, in their attic, in a townhouse in New York, anywhere you can think of. But, she wrote, I have learned that if information is to endure, it requires infrastructure, staff, storage, and the cash flow to pay for them. So the impact we look at this demonstrated investment, quantifiable collections preserved, accessible, supporting research with different enhancements of content. In general, then, what we want to measure is first partners, the creation of the community, the community of practice that we're involved with that demonstration of interest and support, increasing the range of potential funders. Next, implementation of standards, because all of those independent archives were generally, as I said, managed by an individual who had particular ideas about what he or she wanted to do, or different museums, different libraries, different archives. So the standards and that improvement about practices is going to make things possible. Next, the identification of resources, expanding the potential for access, discovery, and use. The more, obviously, we have in terms of funding, the more we can provide. And then engagement, and that could be anywhere from crowdsourcing, but to collaboration, particularly to contributions towards, as I said, content. And last, that has to be supported by a whole variety of programs. As we've already identified, bringing all these groups together in these partnerships is going to involve not just outreach, but community or continuing education, training, support, dissemination of ideas and practices. And that's ongoing as well. That will be ongoing as well. Some of the challenges, funding. Obviously, it's a competitive market out there. Everybody wants some funding. So the approach we took is essentially to work through our partners who had better credibility with the sources of funding we thought were available. So that's, on one hand, increased our opportunities, and on the other hand, as I said, given us credibility with funders who would ordinarily think we were not their optimal target base. But the challenge is all those partners also have multiple priorities. So we're constantly sort of balancing and negotiating what really comes to the fore. Next is what I said earlier, it's not one community, there are multiple communities, and all of them have slightly different needs and interests. So we're essentially trying to reach a consensus about what everybody has in common. And that's an ongoing discussion, which to a certain extent leads to the next point, which is all of this involves a hell of a lot of schmoozing, right? This is a really labor-intensive process in many ways. And the questions that result are, how many projects like that could we support? Probably not a lot, given the staffing we have. And perhaps a more interesting subject for study, what kind of soft skills do we need to have to do this effectively? I don't think this is taught in any library, school, museum program, or information science activity. This is a lot of things we're learning as we go. So it gives us to the moral of the story, which is given our limited resources, not enough staff, not all the right skills, some skimpy budgets, we absolutely need partners. We think partners as well in a project designed around the principle of collaboration will help us attract that funding and demonstrate impact in a multitude of ways. We're making a virtue out of a necessity in some ways, but it's a lot of time, a lot of effort, and invite me back next year and I'll tell you how successful we are. Thank you.
I am Meghan Ferriter, and I'm a Senior Innovation Specialist with the National Digital Initiatives at the Library of Congress, but until 2 months ago, I was a colleague here at the Smithsonian, so it's wonderful to see so many faces of people that I've worked with and had the pleasure to grow from and learn from as well. So I'm going to talk, as you've seen from my title slide that's been up here, I'm going to describe a little bit about the best approaches of working with the public to leverage the valuable time of volunteer contributions. In my time with the Smithsonian Transcription Center, we were supported by the Office of the Chief Information Officer, staff members across the institution, and we could have actually many sessions on designing the best tool for your needs or your goals with a crowdsourcing project. But I'm going to talk about some varying ways that you can use best practice from successful transcription projects to kind of guide and steward and sustain impact, to extend the digitization experience by generating new forms of data, by compelling discovery, by having some of those qualitative stories that Bob talked about that you can share, and potentially acquire more funding or more support. So as you've heard across the last 2 days, the Smithsonian Transcription Center has been very successful in making an impact through building on and extending the digitization pipeline, providing access and discovery of Smithsonian collections since 2013 through the power of the public. And I think that impact can be summarized in a couple of ways. One of those ways is generating useful text for keyword search and also creating augmented metadata that can be used to improve accessibility, discovery, and research around digitized collections. That's not just the impact of the Smithsonian Transcription Center, that's the impact of other successful crowdsourcing projects such as DIY History, which is at the University of Iowa Libraries, Zooniverse projects, which straddle citizen science work and humanities work, and also the projects that were piloted at the New York Public Library Labs. And also a brand new project from the Library of Congress Labs, which is my team, crowdsourcing pilot around World War I newspapers. Crowdsourcing, I think, in the way that I've been involved in, learn from people who are implementing these processes, can be really best summarized by the quote from Dr. Mia Ridge, who's a digital curator at the British Library. And she's talking about not just a one-way exchange of experience or information, but rather something that is greater than the sum of its parts, moving forward and extending the possibilities of a project. So when we build a tool for crowdsourcing, we're probably leveraging the needs and the requirements of an institution. What is the collection, the format of the collection, what needs to be the outcome of that workflow. But the tool is just a tool, and there are many different ways to wield that tool more effectively. And the best ways to hammer out the kinks and understanding around the goals of a project or to ratchet up participation is to think about participant motivations and participant needs and then apply certain approaches. Some of the most well-articulated volunteer motivations and participant motivations in crowdsourcing and citizen science projects are these 4 motivations, and the more darkly colored boxes stand out to me in the most successful projects where people are driven by 2 main goals, 2 main motivations, excuse me. That is to learn, to establish their own learning, a personal and intrinsic motivation, perhaps to further their understanding of the world around them, or just something that they discovered that day and they want to learn more about in the moment. And then the second most prominent motivation is the altruism of the public, that they want to give back to something greater than themselves, that they understand the complexities and the challenges of cultural heritage institutions in providing access to information, and they want to do something more to extend that possibility for researchers. In my time with the Transcription Center, we grew our population, our participant population. We gained over 8,000 volunteers in that time, and we also completed over 250,000 pages of digitized Smithsonian collections, and that is very difficult to summarize succinctly because there's everything ranging from and many of the biodiversity specimens at the museum, the National History Museum, as well as things such as individual pages of correspondence. And similarly, since the launch of our crowdsourcing pilot at the Library of Congress last month, we've had over 47,000 classifications from about 1,700 new volunteers, which sounds like a lot. It's a lot of people's time, and it's a really valuable contribution that people are making, and we want to make sure that we're honoring that and that we're matching up their needs, trying to get towards their motivations. It is not something that we want to take lightly, and we want to acknowledge their contributions in many different ways. From my experience with the Smithsonian Transcription Center and now with the Library of Congress, I've had the opportunity to talk with other people who are managing crowdsourcing projects. And across the board, this is what we see as a set of standard needs for participants. So we have a range of different things that we're asking them to do, whether that is micro tasks of segmenting information, maybe they're helping us with decision trees, maybe they're providing full text transcription, maybe they are entering fielded data to improve or augment digital collections. But if we can make sure that we're providing answers to these needs, connecting these particular needs with the motivations, providing communication and updates the progress of the project that also extends an opportunity to learn more, providing behind-the-scenes access for volunteers who are contributing. Anyone who has ever worked with me or also developed a set of instructions for a volunteer to use knows that people usually don't read those, but they're important to have there. So how can you also design a tool that allows people to get started on a task most easily and not falter? We also know that volunteers or participants in projects such as these need a reason to follow the rules, need a reason to conform. So by better explaining the interrelatedness of these needs, by better explaining, communicating effectively, reinforcing through instructions, why we need the data that we're asking for in particular formats, helps those volunteers adopt and help to shape the contributions of their peers within this space as well. Volunteers also need time to make mistakes and to learn, and that can be uncomfortable. I think I was very fortunate to be supported by staff here at the Smithsonian and also now in my new role to try different approaches, to try to iterate upon those approaches and take the time to understand why people may not be following the instructions as you've asked them, try to empathize with their understanding of what you're asking them to do. And I also think that the most successful crowdsourcing projects provide an opportunity for participants to grow beyond their current role within the project. So whether that's connecting them with another opportunity, for example, some of our Smithsonian Transcription Center volunteers became interested in other crowdsourcing projects, other citizen science projects here within the Smithsonian context, and also at Biodiversity Heritage Library. We have other examples of successful projects that have moved, for example, the Zooniverse, moving a participant from just a normal contributor to being a moderator within a forum, allowing them to leverage what they have learned in their time working on a project and taking that forward to help support new volunteers. So with these two sets of needs and motivations, I kind of think of these 3 C's and 3 G's as the ways that I manage the approach to supporting volunteers. So we think about being a concierge, connecting volunteers with other opportunities, and chatting with them, conversing with them. And then I simultaneously need to guard, guide, and govern. And I'll just give a few examples of these approaches in practice. So some of the ways that I think it's very significant to honor and value the contribution of a volunteer, even if the volunteer doesn't quite do what you're asking them to do. They've taken the time to participate in your project, and by taking the opportunity to reach out to them, to grab onto their experience, talk with them a little bit further about why they interpreted what you've asked them to do in the way that they did, and then leverage that to better communicate the goals of the project. It's really a priceless opportunity, and we did that in a number of different ways. I continue to do that now by receiving feedback emails, by refining instructions, furthering, providing FAQs and things like that. But also taking the time to talk with staff members or the people who have the project goals about here's what we're receiving back from our participants. can we talk about ways that we can modify what we're asking or better explain or refine what we're asking? Other opportunities, I mentioned connecting people to other projects. I'm fortunate that the people with whom I've collaborated in other crowdsourcing projects are supportive of the Smithsonian Transcription Center, are supportive of Beyond Words pilot. We have the opportunity to raise all ships together by connecting people who maybe they really thought that they wanted to do full text transcription, but the reality is they'd rather mark images, so we can connect them to another project to try instead. I think it's also, it's an important role of a community manager, whether you're managing comments or discussions in a forum or you are working with crowdsourcing participants, to be able to allow people to work things out among themselves, but also govern when necessary, make a final decision around what's being asked for and the contributions that are necessary, and to simultaneously guard volunteers from themselves and from the task at hand. I know there's a really well-known example in the Zooniverse where they were doing a challenge, kind of a targeted challenge, and they thought to themselves, we may need to tell this person to go outside and take a breath of fresh air because they have contributed too much to our project. So there's a balance to be had with inviting the participation of the public, but simultaneously thinking about their holistic view of the world. So I think that we're in a period now where we can think about the challenges of scaling these kinds of approaches. We've heard over the last 2 days about the volume of collections. We have the similar challenges at the Library of Congress, the scale and volume of our collections, and finding new ways for people to explore and engage with those collections. And I think that these approaches, crowdsourcing approaches, community engagement approaches, are successful, particularly when targeted within a small, like using SMART approaches, a specific and targeted engagement. But they also can be scaled. They can be implemented in a long-term way. They require probably more than just one individual managing a project. It takes a village to raise a crowdsourcing project, and I would like to think that across the last 2 days here, you've heard from people who have been participating in the Smithsonian Transcription Center from a range of different perspectives. You've seen the exhibits, and you've had the opportunity to connect with them as well. And I also think that we're in a place where we have several years of information about the success and challenges of crowdsourcing projects, and we can start to think about ways that we can have greater interoperability of the tools that we're using, the approaches, the ways that we're communicating, and also finding ways to connect collections across various institutions. And those are things that I think we'll continue to discuss, and hopefully there will be more opportunities around that as well. So I hope that we can continue to iterate and improve upon these different crowdsourcing approaches, whether we're working with projects like the Smithsonian Transcription Center and its continued success. Now we have Andres, who is the fabulous coordinator of the Transcription Center and managed by Qingshan Wang as well. And then we have projects like Beyond Words from the Library of Congress Labs, where we've learned already in a month a lot about the ways that we can connect with staff members and lower the barrier to participation in crowdsourcing at the Library of Congress. And I think that working together, we can try to build upon this people-powered research, which is a tagline from the Zooniverse, and make better connections between the entire digitization chain as well as staff and curators for future projects. So thank you very much.
I think a couple of takeaways I had. Number one, I think of all the creativity we talked about earlier in the conference, about all the great ideas that you have, you need equally great ideas on how to come up with the wherewithal to make all these things happen. And clearly we have a lot of ideas here on how to move ahead. And as you were all going through your individual presentations, I boiled it down to 4 words. So Jaap, you talked about partnerships. Bill, you talked about prioritization. Meghan, you talked about pro bono. And Bob, you talked about the proposition. So I'm going to start off with a question for each panelist. And let me start with Jaap. The Autodesk example obviously is really compelling and has been very successful for us at the Smithsonian. Is there a partnership opportunity that you could point to, or a type of partnership opportunity that wasn't so successful, and what we or you learned from it?
Yes. There certainly is. Actually, I want to answer the question a little bit broader than just for one particular partnership. There's actually an entire industry, in a sense, that we have been trying with pretty hard for the last 2 years, and we still haven't figured out how to do that. So I just, I mentioned the comment from this representative from HTC, which is one of the biggest headset makers for virtual reality headsets, who said, the Smithsonian is the biggest content repository in the world. So that sounded incredibly promising. And that was all in the context of trying to basically get companies like HTC, but actually even more very large technology companies that have platforms for online content, Facebook, Google, Apple, basically everybody has something going on or is working on something to say to them, help us create more 3D content, and then you will have somehow you'll be able to use this in a way. So I mean, how we do that use piece is another question, because there's there are things around commercial use and all of that. But besides that, it turns out that actually, for the last 2 years, we have pretty much been circling each other there, and we have been talking to every big name company that's out there, and it's still nothing concrete has happened here. So this is actually an interesting thing that I briefly talked about yesterday with one of the other participants in the conference who has a lot of connections to industry, and her comment was basically, yes, I think the whole virtual reality and 3D, it's so much still in its infancy, also in the industry side, that no one has really figured out yet, outside of video gaming, where there's a clear user base, how to really basically build a business model on this. I mean, we're all talk about education. That's a logical way to go for the Smithsonian, but people haven't really taken us up on this huge opportunity. So I think it will happen at some point, but it's something we have been struggling with, to find partners there to work with content and help us create more.
So a $10 prize for anyone who can help us break through on that industry. Bill, thank you for the airplane metaphor. You didn't see Bill and I labeled on there because we were inside the plane starting the beverage service. Question for you, Bill. You have this incredibly responsible position of overseeing the collections here. And as you think about digitization, do you see a tension between digitization from the perspective of the conservator or the steward of the collection versus digitization from the perspective of trying to unlock our assets to an expanding audience?
No, absolutely not. I mean, when I look at the care of collections, I see it broadly. I see collection stewardship, and digitization is a component part of stewardship. It's a method by which we can increase our access to collections. There's component parts to digitization that helps basic collections care, whether it's inventory control, as well as curation. We're also learning through, I think, digitization, how we can improve preservation and conservation of our objects. Some of the things that have come out of the botany project at Natural History is really revealing from a preservation standpoint. And I think there's different types of machine learning that could give us new insights into basic collections care that right now we just don't know what that capability is until the technology becomes more real and more applicable. But I think a lot of people view it as a tug-pull, back and forth between those worlds. But as I think the keynote speaker yesterday spoke about, and I like to use the same example, I mean, Raiders of the Lost Ark, we don't acquire these collections to just put them into a warehouse, whether it's out at MSC or somewhere else. We acquire them to preserve them for the future and for the public, but we need to provide access. So I think it's striking that balance. making sure that all the stakeholders are part of those conversations, whether it's conservators, people that are doing digitization, the curatorial staff, the public programming. I think we're getting better at having educators and public programming more involved in those discussions, where traditionally I think collections care or collections stewardship has been very siloed. And I think one of the points I was trying to make is, through my discussion, is that we need to be more cross-disciplinary, more integrated in our discussions of why do we have these collections, why do we want to provide access, what's the methods and things like that, and do it in an efficient manner. So I see it hand in hand of really what collection stewardship is really all about.
Yeah, and I'd just like to recognize you, because when I think about how our federal appropriation has changed over time, it's been relatively stable over many, many years. But one of the places where we've gotten some increase in resources because of the compelling case that we've made has been around collections care and stewardship. And so your efforts have been central to achieving that.
I'll just thank you, Al, for that compliment. Or it's been a team effort. I would say my title, actually, even though I'm director of the National Collections Program, is National Collections Coordinator. And I think when that was created back in 1993, we exactly knew what I was going to be doing for the rest of my tenure here at the Smithsonian, is coordinate, facilitate, enable. I started my career back in 1985 at American History as a collections manager, museum specialist, and what I remember every day I come to work is how do I, the person that's in that position now, how do I enable them, give them the tools, the resources to do their job?
Yeah, I understand that completely. When I bang my fist on the table, people laugh at me here. So, Bob, I'm really intrigued by your presentation, and my observation from about 10,000 feet is that a lot of the projects that we embark on in the realm of digitization at the start are very speculative, really experimental. So as you're moving toward approaching a potential funder with an idea that could be still fairly nebulous, how do you create that case to get them engaged and to help them to see sort of where you're headed, so that hopefully they could be part of something really, really big?
Well, I think, perhaps I could offer two suggestions. And one, I used to work for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, so I was a funder and I gave away money. And in order to get money from the IMLS, you had to provide an application with a pile of documentation and tremendous amount of information, and it went through multiple review processes. But the actual decision to fund something was still a leap of faith, right? You needed to say somehow, yeah, she can do it, and that could, and she could. But the knowledge or the assurance that a funder might have is going to be based on the fact that Meghan's given talk. I'll just use you an example, Meghan. Meghan's given talks. She's been at conferences. She's written papers. She's demonstrated through a whole variety of ways, ancillary or on a contextual basis to the application, that she has established that credibility to warrant the leap of faith. So I think a lot of speculative proposals are going to be funded and supported if that credibility is there. And the Smithsonian has an enormous amount of credibility, but I think this is one area where certainly in American history we would need to build up more credibility, because we haven't been to the conferences, we haven't written anything, we haven't done some basic stuff. So we need to start small. The other thing I would say from the idea of a proposition is each funding source has its own agenda. And in the case of this project I was talking about, because of the fact we're working through our partners rather than being the applicant ourselves, we are borrowing their credibility. And it opens us up to a possibility of funding from a variety of groups that would basically not listen to us, despite being from the Smithsonian, because they're just not interested in funding us to do something along these lines. But our being a partner to someone else is a way forward. So those two aspects, I think all of us need to, and all our institutions have to think about all the things we need to do to establish credibility in this area. And it's not just having a good idea. And the other thing that we have to really be targeted about is to understand who's willing to listen to us or not.
And Meghan, I guess we shouldn't be so surprised that crowdsourcing and digital volunteers have become such a success for us, because the Smithsonian historically has magnified its impact because of volunteers, right? We have more volunteers than we actually have employees at the Smithsonian. Can you give us an example or two of a specific case where you could point to a particular relationship that's been developed through crowdsourcing and digital volunteerism that's really made an impact on you and really created deep engagement with particular people?
Sure, thank you for asking. I'd like to kind of turn that toward an impact on building relationships throughout the institution and then externally as well. And I can think of two examples. I gave an example of some of our volunteers at the Smithsonian Transcription Center feeling empowered. As Bill said, part of my role as a coordinator was to help coordinate projects, but also to coordinate individuals. And what the feedback that they provided is that they felt empowered to do things they wouldn't have done before. They suddenly felt empowered to connect things from the Smithsonian Transcription Center into Wikipedia, or to put it into eBird, which is a citizen science project, or to join new projects and to see themselves as valuable, whether or not they're an expert or they've had 15 years of training in a particular subject. But because they've developed expertise through the process of crowdsourcing, through their experience, they felt that they could, yes, they can try it, they could do it, they could learn from it, and they can share their experience with others. And I think a second very powerful impact through crowdsourcing is the partnerships with other institutions. So my colleague here, Bob, shared the result of the Phyllis Diller joke file, which was transcribed, 50,000 cards transcribed in approximately 3 weeks by volunteers, and then shared that with my now current colleagues at the Library of Congress so that they could use that as a collection to think about data in an innovative way, to hack on that data, to come out with a different output, to understand the impact of Phyllis Diller, not just as an entertainer and as a cultural icon, as an influential woman, but actually the content of her jokes, and to find new patterns within that. And I think that these are ways that inviting the public to participate in touching our collections, creating data around our collections, has had impact in creating partnerships.
Only at the Smithsonian could you hear about Phyllis Diller joke files and think about the National Parasite Collection in the same breath. Let's open it up. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
So I'm on a much smaller scale of development work, but it's been interesting to sort of see how donors have changed over the years, and sort of thinking about, what do you guys perceive those changes, and how do you see digitization like helping to enhance those relationships, or I don't know, what would those effects be?
Yes. So obviously, I mean, I've spoken about the technology companies, and then we have like a direct interest in what we do, and then there are the companies that are looking at us for content that's not there yet, but where we're saying, help us create it if you're so interested. But then also with more traditional donors, you're starting to see a big interest in digitization. Actually, I think they realize that this could be is going to be really, really important for our access and outreach. Basically, how we're going to reach millions and billions of people worldwide. We don't want them to all come to the Smithsonian. So I think that's definitely. I mean, there's one example that I can give you specifically for our digitization program, where a private donor actually said, we really understand, the need of this. How can we help? And the nice thing about that was that it actually wasn't driven by some huge need for innovation or anything. They just were willing to basically help fund the plumbing, which is always the hardest part. Basically, hard to get specific funding for that from any outside party, so that was really great. So it's yeah, people are definitely, just like everybody else, I mean, also funders are looking around and see what's happening in the world, basically, and going along with the times. Does that answer the question?
Other questions?
Thank you all for a wonderful panel. This is a question directed towards Meghan. It's very exciting to learn more about what's happening with transcription services here at the Smithsonian and at the Library of Congress. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to the process perhaps that the Smithsonian and maybe the Library of Congress has gone through in terms of establishing, if necessary, sort of a culture shift that has made it possible for subject area experts to really feel confident in the quality of the transcription, the quality of the information, the quality of the vetting that is happening to enable crowdsourcing to be such a success.
Yes, I think the number one question when I meet people and I say, oh, I do crowdsourcing, work with crowdsourcing, they say, tell me about the quality. And that is a number one question. It's the highest concern, and clearly it's extremely important, particularly when we're working with biodiversity collections. The metadata needs to be very specific. It needs to be formatted in particular ways, and we want to save staff time and by making sure that's in the correct format as well. I think that what we found with the Smithsonian Transcription Center and also with the Library of Congress pilot with Beyond Words is to start small and to use evidence to start to immediately assess and provide an opportunity for staff members to see firsthand what is the impact. Simultaneously sharing the stories of engagement, the stories of personal connection with collections, the impact of the Phyllis Diller joke file, for example, people sharing their experiences in hearing her or seeing her for the first time, remembering stories, the number of individuals who actually had worked with her, intersected with her in her career, who sent those stories back to the institution. So opening the doors to these particular projects, simultaneously evaluating at a very small scale, at a piloting type scale, the quality of data, while also sharing the range of other benefits of these types of projects, I think had gained traction in both of these particular spaces. I think there are also always going to be people who have resistance to what they consider to be a non-scholarly version of text that's created around an object. And I think that my argument would be those things don't have to be in, one doesn't have to replace the other. You can have them in tandem. You can present them in new and innovative ways within a digital space that allow people to explore what's a refined scholarly edition and also a crowd-generated version of that.
I used to work with Roy Rosenzweig, who's, I think, notable for all sorts of things he did in George Mason and really sort of helped found digital humanities, develop a whole variety of tools. And his motto was, perfect is the enemy of the good. You know, that if we demand perfection, we are never going to be able to achieve anything like what we need to do. So being able to work with good enough data or good enough products is really going to help us address the problems we've been talking about for 2 days now, scale, volume, the daunting prospects we have in terms of the amount of work we have to do.
Increasingly are asking research and cultural institutions to collaborate on grants to make a bigger impact globally and nationally. There are lots of barriers to that, including institutional ego, who gets the slice of the pie, all of those types of things, as well as internal intellectual property barriers. Any thoughts on how a large institution like the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress can work collaboratively in these spheres to overcome those barriers?
My first answer, Martin, would be very often it's not institutions working together, it's individuals. And that allows for a whole variety of things to start. And then sustainability is the product of the institution sort of catching up to a certain extent. But I think, you know, the personal relationships that develop in terms of just meetings or conferences or panels are really the catalyst for that. And if those aren't there, then there'll never be any ongoing effort. So that may sound, you know, as if I'm hooked on this schmoozing idea, but In fact, I think it really is kind of the grease that allows the machinery to move forward.
And just a suggestion, I think higher education research funding, scientific research funding over the last 20 years has really been driven toward much bigger, broader, multi-institution kinds of projects. There might be some lessons to learn there. The bottom line is, if you want to take on bigger problems, solve bigger challenges, you've got to partner. There's really no other way to take those things on.
I'd also like to add, I was speaking mostly about approaches and not the tool itself, but I think sometimes by sharing a tool or inviting people to use versions of tools, sharing source code around particular solutions to challenges can also be a little bit of a wedge to drive in toward seeing similarities across the needs or the capabilities of institutions as well.
I can just add to that I can just see in the kind of the problems that the challenges that the digitization, 3D digitization, for example, has. I think it's rare that for any of those there's just one party that has all the answers in house, basically. So what we are, we know that if we want to kind of solve something from beginning to end, we'll have to assemble some kind of coalition where the Smithsonian only has a piece of the puzzle, and then there are probably several others that have other pieces, and so I think it's just a reality, not just from a funder who requests that we do this, but actually just to get the thing done, basically we have to do it.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Meghan, I had a question. So most cultural heritage organizations have done crowdsourcing at a smaller scale. What do you see as being important to ramping up what we can do as organizations?
I think that's a really good question, and thank you for asking it. I think that a small scale allows you to really quickly show impact, and I think a lot of these projects have been grant funded rather than the Smithsonian Transcription Center is internally funded, Library of Congress Lab is internally funded, but a lot of projects that are coming out of, and people are doing innovative things around grant-based funding, and I would like to see an extension of that, of people bringing their results together to scale up to find collaborative solutions, interoperable solutions. I think that there are also opportunities by creating greater investment around the forms of communication, whether that is a team of people communicating, targeted interaction with target audiences, such as educational environments, greater collaboration between, let's say, ed outreach and a crowdsourcing program, things like that. I think those are probably some ways to start to address the scale that larger cultural heritage institutions are trying to wrap their arms around.
One more question? Everybody ready to pack it in? Okay. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you. I'm supposed to deliver some closing comments, but I really have no words because everything that has been said by the panelists today, there's nothing I can say that beats what they have already said in their presentations. They've been so amazing across the board. But I do have some words of thanks, and that is to reiterate thanks for my entire team in DPO, for my bigger team in OCIO, for everybody who has made this day a fantastic day, from speakers to sponsors to the exhibitors to our Crackerjack AV team here. And I wanted to end with a story. We were talking about storytelling as being important for impact. And I don't know if Madeline is here, Madeline Runberg. She might have left. She told me a story today that I just want to relay to you. It's actually kind of two stories. The first was she thanked us because the way we had structured the conference, she said, was so useful that she could sit while she was at lunch or even during a session and parse out to her team back home, watch this bit, look at minute 52, and she was, passing this all back and forth. We had Twitter handles. The presenters presented some URLs. So she was able to do all of that, which is something she usually does when she gets back home. And she said she doesn't do it as well because work gets in the way. So she was able to kind of spread the information right now in real time, which I thought was wonderful. But the second story with that was she had come from Utah, and she was a little bit tired, so she decided to skip some sessions this morning, and she was in her hotel room. She thought she'd watch the webcast. Well, that's great. So she puts the webcast on her computer, and she's watching it, and as she gets ready, she decides she's going to leave. She thinks, okay, I'll just put it on my phone now, and I'll watch it as long as I can watch it, as long as the live stream keeps going. And she goes out into the elevator of her hotel, goes down, walks out into the street. Live stream's still working. She's watching it. She goes into the metro. It's still working. She gets all the way here, comes in. She didn't miss a single minute of a session because it worked the whole time from her hotel room to here. And to my mind, that's an impact for the conference that's fantastic. We didn't plan for that impact because I didn't have Harry's book at that time to plan, but it's an impact nonetheless. And I would hope that I could ask you all to leave today with the idea that we all try to make a similar type of impact planned, we hope, to deliver with intent, of that nature, that we can do that kind of goodwill and effort that has an important, as Martin said in his BHL study, we gave her the gift of time. And there's so many more gifts we can give. So thank you very much for these incredible 2 days. I appreciate it. Please let us know your comments. You've been very kind to me to my face. That's okay. I appreciate that. But we also can take constructive criticism, and you know where to reach us. We have to do this in 2 years, and we'd like to make it even better. So we would welcome your comments. And thank you all once again. Big hand to you all.